Hello, horror fans, and welcome back to the Script to Screen podcast. Now, on the show today, we have a very special guest with us. We're delighted to welcome Phil Parker to the show. Welcome, Phil.
Hello.
Hello there. Phil is a writer and a development consultant, has a wealth of experience working all over the world. But Lee and I first really became aware of you, Phil, as I was sort of saying previously on our MA, where we studied, some of the concepts and the ideas that you put forward in your amazing book, The Art and Science of Screenwriting. So, for the audience out there, Phil's book really heavily influenced how Lee and I think about screenwriting, idea development, character development, really clarified how we think and talk about genre, theme, style, and tone, and really helped us talk about our work, especially when we're sort of pitching ideas to people. So, today, Phil is going to take us on a deep dive into the horror genre specifically, but we'd highly recommend that you seek out Phil's book, and we'll certainly add a link in the description as to where you can pick that up because it's really a sort of clarifying piece of work. So Phil, welcome again. Maybe a good place to start is just letting us know a little bit about how you sort of think about and define horror as a genre.
Yeah, indeed. Genre for me is one of the four great genre groups that I sort of identified. Horror sadly was not written up in the book because there was a limited amount of space at the time. And so the notes got published later in a magazine called Scriptwriter, which is no longer available, sadly. If I redo the book, and I am getting pressure from quite a lot of people to re-update the book,
Oh, we'd love
so
that.
that may come about in the not too distant future. But in the meantime, I can run through today the sort of primary elements of how horror actually works. But just to be clear, the other three groups that I identified, which are in the book, are romances, thrillers, and what I call personal dramas, which is actually the dominant group of
Mm,
films made in the UK and Europe. And quite often are films that sometimes people put in the horror camp. A classic last year was Frankenstein.
right.
Frankenstein is not actually a horror film. It has a monster in it, but it's not a horror film. It is
Mm,
very much a personal drama. And so, it's this ability to identify in your work the core genre that you're actually attempting to work with as a framework. And it is this idea that genre is a framework made up of certain key elements. I mean, there were two levels of elements that I identified in the book. Primary elements, which is what you get in all of the sort of subgenres that work within any one genre. And these are like key elements you look for when you're developing an idea or reading a treatment or a synopsis and going, well, what is there and what isn't there? Because you need to put all those primary elements together in a way that then allows you to look at the specific subgenre you're going to work with. Now, often in development, it has to be said, when people first throw down ideas, certainly up to treatment level, sometimes even first drafts, there's at least two films in there, and often two completely separate genres. And it's one of the critical questions one faces in early stages of development was, well, which genre are we actually working in?
yeah.
So, for instance, to give you a really up-to-date example, I'm working on a project in Europe at the moment where the director and the producer came to me and they were convinced that they were creating a horror movie. And I read through the material, they'd done a first draft, and they had what I call classic horror tropes, a sort of fantasy figure, blood on the wall, etc., etc. Core of the film was a personal drama. It's just that because they had these tropes, they thought they were working in a horror
Yeah,
situation.
sure.
And that's the other thing. The fact that the subject matter of a film is horrific does
Yeah.
not make it a horror film.
No,
And a lot
absolutely.
of people also fall into that trap. And you go, oh God, it's horrible. They're cutting up bodies, and that does not make it a horror film.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, you can do lots of horrific things in narratives, but they don't take you into the horror space because the
Yeah.
horror space is a very, very specific space. Many people find it difficult to define the difference between thriller and horror because they share a huge amount of common ground.
Absolutely, yeah.
Huge amount of common ground. The major dividing line is that horror requires a supernatural force, whereas thriller doesn't. Thriller
Yeah.
stays within our reality, the lived reality that we experience as human beings. Whereas horror needs a supernatural force to
Yeah.
take you into a different realm of
Yeah.
some description. So that's one of the key dividing lines and one of the key elements you look for when you're trying to develop a horror project. Is there actually something supernatural driving the narrative? If there isn't, the chances are you are actually writing a thriller or even a personal drama. So that's one of the first things you look for. One of the other critical factors, again, that tends to differentiate you from most thrillers is that horror requires you to locate your central protagonists as ordinary people. The essence of horror for a modern contemporary audience is that they're watching people who are like them. There is a sense that we're close to these people. And so even if you said it historically, you choose characters and a setting that is familiar to the audience. They get it. They feel that this is territory they know.
Yeah.
So, like Sinners last year, one could argue, well, most of the audience are not members of the black community in America in the 1930s.
Yeah.
That's
That
not
would be a
that's
fair
not
assumption.
most of a contemporary audience. In fact, it's none of the
Yeah.
contemporary audience.
Yeah.
But that opening sequence where you've got the Baptist church and the singing and that whole sense of a town in the 1930s and rich guys turning up, with money, opening up a new club, all of that feels very familiar.
Mm. Yeah. There are
And so
cultural touchstones.
yeah, exactly. You're in that world because you're already aware of that world before the film starts. And so this is one of the other things that's critical to horror is that you have to establish this ordinary world for your audience where they feel they know it. They sense, oh, I know these people. I know what they're like. I have some empathy, even direct empathy for them. And those are the beginning points. A third thing, which is also in thrillers, is the idea that the central protagonist must face death. Now,
Right.
this is something that quite often people don't quite understand. They sort of think, well, if they're scared, that's good enough. No, no, we've got to believe they could die.
Mm.
And at some point, you've got to prove that to the audience in the
Yeah.
narrative. It's
Yeah.
not an option. It's like, no, no, the central protagonist can die. This is the whole bloody point here. You're
Yeah.
facing death.
That's the peril. So a B or a C
um,
character may sort of perish along the way,
well,
to
that's
sort
the
of
whole
illustrate
point.
this.
That's
Yeah.
yeah, that's the whole point of those secondary characters.
Yeah.
And horror is one of those genres where you can bump off as many secondary characters as you like. No one cares. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
you do that in a romantic piece, and people are going, "What the hell's going on here?"
Yeah. Sure.
It's
Sure.
just like this. It doesn't belong here.
Maybe this is a horror.
Maybe this is
Yeah.
a horror film.
Yeah.
They've just got the whole setup wrong.
Yeah. Sure.
But you have got the use of love stories within horror films,
Mm.
going back to the very beginning of the horror genre. So like early Nosferatu work and modern vampire movies.
I was going to
And then you
say,
come
yeah.
into things, where a romance story is a clear sort of option for a central protagonist as to why they get involved. And there was a lovely little vampire movie done, oh, nearly 20 years ago now, out of, I think it was Denmark, might have been Sweden, called Let the Right One In.
Funnily enough, I was
Uh,
just going to reference that. Yeah, the
yeah,
central story there is very much a sort of
it's a
tragic love
romance
story. Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great film.
And, but, it's vampires and people are getting killed,
Yeah.
and it's just twists how you approach what do you do with a vampire. Now, that got taken to an extreme level when you hit Twilight,
Right.
where basically you stopped being a horror movie because essentially you were saying vampires and werewolves were the normal beings in our world. And so you
Mm.
stepped out of, you were using all these tropes of characterization, but you stepped out of horror completely and said, no, no, this is the normal world. And
Mm.
that's exactly what happened when you had Underworld, where you
Yes.
had werewolves were the normal world. And so you can use really well established horror characters in a totally different genre. And this is where tropes and characterization can mislead people as to what genre they're actually working in.
And this is really an important point, I feel, and really the sort of, as I mentioned, the clarifying thing that me and Lee found in your work, being able to sort of differentiate between something like a trope and a genre itself, and how you can sort of differentiate and talk about those things.
Yeah. And it's extremely important in development because ultimately the audience is not a blank slate. They come having watched hundreds, if not thousands, of narratives by
Yeah.
the time they get to your work. And they've learned stuff without knowing they've learned it. They've learned stuff about how narrative works and what
Mm,
their expectations are.
yeah.
And essentially, what a genre framework does is go, I'm giving you what you expect, but then I'm adding to that all my original stuff. And that's how you should think of a genre framework. It's essentially like the skeleton of a human body. All of us on the planet pretty well have the same skeleton, but I don't see anyone going around the planet going, well, every human being's exactly the same then.
Yeah,
You know, and,
for
and,
sure.
and, and that's the thing about a genre framework. It's there to support the originality. But
Yeah.
if it isn't there, the originality tends to collapse
Right.
because the audience doesn't know where it's going. It doesn't know what you're trying to achieve. And this is the really critical thing to understand about genre frameworks is that they are that underpinning that they allow the audience to feel their way onto what is familiar territory, but then surprise them with your original take on character setting, plot development, and the overall themes you're working with.
Yeah.
Now, there are two major themes that work in the horror space. And the first one of those is the fear of death. Now, a lot of people think when I say that, you mean, oh, we don't want to die. No, 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 that's not what I'm talking about. It's the fact that we all know we are going to die. And at the point where we die, there will be things we wish we'd said or done.
Right.
And if you can go to every single culture on the planet, and every single one of them has got ghost and spirit story or spirit stories. And those ghost and spirit stories are about saying we're addressing the incomplete life because
Okay.
everyone dies at a point where they haven't done or said all the things they ought to have done or said.
That's really interesting, Phil, because you you would imagine sort of just that you would be the fear would come from the potential pain preceding death, rather than, as you say, the sort of the things that weren't said or the sort of incomplete life. But that's really fascinating.
Yeah, no, and that's why we love ghost stories and spirit stories. Because
Mm,
if you go back through modern contemporary cinema and look at a certain type of horror story, it is all about the past coming into the present via a spirit or a monster or a ghost. And that's all about the incomplete life.
yeah.
Now, the other theme that you can work with in horror is the fear of the unknown. And
Yeah.
this is this really awful thing about being a human being, which is no matter how many books you read, no matter how many people you talk to, no matter how many countries you visit on the planet, you'll never know everything.
Yeah. Sure. Sure.
And as a result, you're conscious, not necessarily in a day-to-day level, but you're conscious that the world is unknown to you and that things can come out of that unknown and destroy your life. Now, that could be as simple as being hit by a bus as you could walk down the road tomorrow morning, to the idea that, someone is going to create a virus that's going to wipe out a third of humanity,
Mm,
and you're not going to see it coming,
yeah.
which, of course, is what, had contagion and all of those sorts of things, got into and it, became hugely popular around COVID. These are all about fear of the unknown. Now, the trick with the fear, the fear of death is an ongoing thing. It doesn't reflect contemporary stuff as such, but I'll come on to that. But the fear of the unknown is very much about looking at the future and going, I can project into the future things that could come to get us. So in the recent past, we've had a lot of AI generated monsters. and twists. Some of these have been horror, some of them have been thriller, but it's a classic of looking a little bit forward into contemporary life and
Mm.
going, what is out there or what could be out there in a few years' time that could actually come and kill a human being,
Yeah.
could come and get us, basically.
Yeah.
So those are the two underlying themes you're working with, and you need to know which one you're working with in any one narrative, because there's only ever one in any singular narrative.
Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
need to know whether you're dealing with the fear of death or the fear of the unknown. Once you've decided that, life becomes a lot simpler.
Yeah.
Believe
Yeah.
me. I
Yeah.
mean, you've still got to create an original piece of work, but at
Of
least you've
course.
got a good basis on which to make some key decisions.
Well, I think you have the framework there, but you also have a means to express your idea in a very sort of clear and succinct way. And I
Yeah.
think, this is, as I mentioned to you sort of earlier, one of the ways that your book really clarifies to us is how to talk about theme. And rather than sort of kind of waffle vaguely about something that's not quite graspable, being able to sort of talk about something as primal as a fear of death or the fear of the unknown was really really clarifying for us, Phil, as in how to talk about these ideas.
Yeah, and it's really important to making a great film.
Mm,
I mean, it's very useful when you're pitching, absolutely,
yeah.
or writing up a synopsis for somebody, so you can just state very boldly, this is what the underlying theme of the work is,
Mm,
and it's easy for everyone to grasp.
yeah.
But it's also about the fact that this is what connects you to the rest of humanity. These are human feelings. They're not your feelings, they're everyone's feelings.
Yeah.
And that's why horror has survived and evolved throughout the whole of human history. It started off largely being about ghosts and spirits, but it evolved into embracing monsters and ultimately disasters, be it a big supernatural style disasters. Another thing that's critical in developing the idea is that the antagonist, initially, as far as the narrative is concerned, needs to be stronger and cleverer than your protagonist. Now, that at one level that goes without saying. It's like almost everybody grasps that. But what they don't grasp is if you're going to make them more powerful, you've also got to work out how, in the end of the day, people are either going to escape or not escape
Yeah.
that power.
Yeah.
There's a very famous story. A book was written in the early 1960s in America, in which a bunch of teenagers stumbled into a valley in this hidden valley in the Sierra Nevadas, where a bunch of werewolves had lived quite happily for centuries, undisturbed by anybody. But of course, the werewolves were aware that if these teenagers left the valley, their hiddenness and their secret society would be blown and people would come to hunt them. So they had to kill the teenagers. And that was the premise of the book. And of course, every studio in America wanted to make that movie. It was teenagers in peril with werewolves. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah, it sells itself.
It was a sort of given. So every studio in turn optioned the book and tried to get a screenplay out of it. And none of them worked. None of them worked. And it went round through about 3 studios over a period of about 15 years, where they optioned it, tried to get a script out of it for 3 or 4 years, and then eventually did what they call put it in turnaround,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
meant that someone else could buy the option. And eventually, I forget which studio it was now, they went to a guy called John Sayles, who started his whole screenwriting directing career doing low budget horror movies, which are quite brilliant. Piranha, for instance, is a classic.
Yeah.
Um, and they said, John, can you read this and tell us, how to make a great movie out? You've done all these 2 or 3 really low budget, very successful little horror movies. And he said, okay, I'll have a look at it. And he went away and he came back and he said, okay. And he goes, well, have you got the answer? And he goes, yeah, it's pretty simple, really. In the book, the teenager just runs away and gets away. You can't do that in film. No one
Yeah.
will
Sure.
buy that as a solution. So somehow that teenager's got to work out how they can outwit the werewolf or kill one in order to get away.
Right,
If you
right, yeah.
don't do that, the film's dead.
Well, it's overcoming that sort of challenge, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
that's what you want your protagonist
exactly.
to be doing, right?
Yeah. And if you and it sounds so simple, but you'd be staggered at the number of people who don't manage to do that. And they
Yeah.
just allow the protagonist to sort of somehow just escape the power, and just go
Right.
over the hill or drive away in a car or turn around and shoot the monster, and the monster just drops dead all of a sudden, when
Yeah,
it wasn't credible that they were going to drop dead from just being shot.
sure.
Um, and seriously, at this level, the number of simple mistakes is horrific. Um, the one of the other key factors in this genre, which is beautiful about it, is the omnipresent camera point of view.
Yes. So the sort
You
of
know,
POV, yeah.
yeah, the idea that you as an audience can be watching something happening from almost any angle that the director and the writer decide.
Mm,
You can be the monster's point of view, you can be an innocent's point of view, you can be a bystander's point of view, you can have an omnipresent point of view. You can literally have a director's eye over a whole scene.
yeah. Yeah.
Um, and this is one of the few genres where well, in fact, the only genre where that's absolutely true across the board.
Yeah.
There are other subgenres and other types of narrative within personal drama, for instance, where you can do that as well. But this genre, absolutely, you've got the freedom to stick the camera anywhere, come up with points of view that just make the plot more interesting.
Yes. Yeah. Well, those kind of moments also can increase the sense of peril as well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, no, no.
Particularly, I'm
Uh,
thinking sort of things like sort of POV cams in various horror films, where you're
well, Blair Witch and
exactly
all the
Halloween.
ones
Yeah.
that have copied Blair Witch since, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because there was one last year that did that. God, I forgot what the title of it was. Oh God, there was one last year that followed a similar trajectory, and of course you had Insidious,
Right.
things like that. That similar tricks. It's like,
Mm.
oh, you got a hidden camera and you're watching what's going on.
Yeah, well, that is a
Um,
very sort of like the paranormal sort of, well, certainly the first paranormal
Paranormal is a
activity,
classic. Yeah,
with the that sort of, almost like a security cam, baby monitor sort
yeah,
of camera. That's very much an omnipresent sort of view of the world, watching things
yeah,
take place. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So you've got all of that. Other things that are important to the genre. There are two or three stories that are used again and again and again, are incredibly useful to the genre.
This is
The
what I find
first,
this really interesting, Phil. Yeah.
yeah, there is the classic spider and the fly idea, which is, of course, the antagonist entrapping the protagonist. So one of the first things you've got to ask yourself when you're developing an antagonistic force within a horror genre is, what is their real power and what is their goal? What do they actually want?
Mm,
So, for instance, if you take something like Predator, their idea there is that they were trying to work out, could they take over the planet?
yeah.
This was an advanced species forerunner, a sort of ground troop
A
trying to work
scout.
out a scout, basically. And, it was like they had powers that no human being had ever encountered before. And they had to be defeated in all the different versions of Predator now in different ways. But that was a classic spider and fly scenario where the Predator was always entrapping the
Yeah.
protagonist, walked into their space. And then the protagonist turned that around and trapped the antagonist.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so the
Yeah.
spider and fly story gets inverted the other way around in the final part of the narrative. I mean, another crucial element of story type is the fatal flaw. All monsters have, or ghosts, or whatever force you're dealing with, has to have a fatal flaw, something that the human beings involved in this narrative either ultimately yes, ultimately they discover it, and
Mm.
then they work out how they can use it to save themselves.
Yeah.
And then there's one that is story type that's not used as a main story, but is in most horror films because it's incredibly useful, is the unrecognized virtue.
Right.
One of your protagonists or your main protagonist has a skill, an ability that the bulk of the people in the group don't have.
Mm.
And at first, it's not recognized the power of this individual, that what their skill is or how it can be used. But ultimately, it becomes a way of actually defeating the antagonistic force. And so those three story types are there in most horror films. And it's not like, you have to have a romance story or you have to have a quest or any one of the other 10 major story types that are available. But these three you're going to find coming up in most horror movies.
Mm.
And that's, fair enough. They're incredibly useful. Again, like I said, the framework of genre is to allow the audience to feel that they know the territory they're in,
Yeah.
while at the same time you're bringing a whole pile of original material on top.
Yeah. Yeah.
And these three story types are really familiar to audiences.
Mm.
They get it and they understand it and they'll accept it from you when you put it in your narrative.
Yeah, it's almost like a subconscious sort of thing that the audiences just can get and latch onto, and they're in. Um,
Yeah, yeah. And also it's credible. The idea
yeah.
that your protagonist has got a fatal flaw, if you then show that to the audience like two-thirds, three-quarters of the way through the film, they'll go, "Oh, right, yeah, we get this. This is what we expected." They're not suddenly thrown and going, "Oh, hold on a second, where did that come from?"
I was going to say, Phil, with the fatal flaw, is that sort of something that you think is limited to the antagonist, or could a fatal flaw be something that a protagonist has, which they kind of need to overcome in a way?
Oh
Uh,
yeah, no, I mean, these stories can, when you're dealing with characters, you can give them any one of these stories in nearly every single genre. And the real trick is for you to work out, you know, what is it that is in your particular horror piece
mm,
is gonna, the fatal flaw, what is it? Because
yeah,
if the antagonist doesn't have it, it just means that they're bound to win.
yeah, sure, sure, sure.
No, you may be, a complete nihilist about this, and you may think that humanity's doomed, and so you want to show that your monster can completely wipe out anyone who comes across their path, and that's the end of your film.
Yeah,
Now, that may be where you, as a creative, want to take the narrative, but somewhere along the line, the human beings will have believed there was a fatal flaw, will have tried it and failed.
right.
It's that sort of awareness of the expectation in the audience because narratives do not end predictably in that sense. That's very much in the creator's choice. It's your way of saying to the world, this is how I see this type of conflict being resolved.
Yeah,
Now, the other thing that's important to horror movies, because you're dealing with ordinary people, is the existence of an expert. Some people might think, oh, really? Why can't I have the person who's the lead being the expert? Well, because then they're not like us. And whereas in a detective thriller, for instance, the detective is nothing like us. They
yeah,
are special people. And that matter that you can buy that in a thriller.
mm,
But in a horror, you want the protagonist to be as ordinary as possible. And so you need an expert to come along and explain what the hell is going on
right.
at some point to the protagonist.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
So, I mean, you saw that in Sinners, you see it in all really great horror movies.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Now, the question of, you know, credible action, supernatural action, etc., etc. Because we're dealing with ordinary people in our world as such, most of the action has to take place in our reality in the same way it does in thrillers.
mm,
The difference is that the force of the antagonist smashes through that reality in some way, shape, or form. And once they've smashed through, then you can go into supernatural worlds,
Mm.
representations of the afterlife, or, massive monsters gathering or whatever.
You see that sort of thing in Stranger Things, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So, initially you're absolutely in our reality. Now, when I say initially, certainly that's the whole of Act One.
Mm.
And most of the time, it's most of the film.
Yeah.
The monster or the ghost pops into this reality. It doesn't take it over. It just intrudes into it. Now, there are times when you're going to flip that a bit more. So, like if you go into one or two of Guillermo del Toro's films, it's something like Pan's Labyrinth,
Mm.
where you sort of disappear into a complete fantasy world for
Yeah.
parts of the narrative. You can do that. That's completely legitimate.
Mm.
And it's like when you're dealing with ghosts, you can allow the protagonist to enter into the spirit's world in order to grasp the nature of what the spirit wants.
Right.
So there are ways in which you can, and if you look at some of the Studio Ghibli work in animation,
Hmm.
where you've got ghosts being treated as ordinary characters,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. The difficulty there is are we genuinely in horror when we do that? And I would argue you're not.
Mm.
The Studio Ghibli work uses all these spirits and so on as part of our reality. And therefore it's more personal drama than it is horror.
Yeah.
And that's like the point I made about Twilight. You know, the fact that the werewolves and the vampires are there means it's not a horror movie because they're there. They're just part of our world.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Now, stylistically, you're looking at the fact that horror is one of those genres where you've got a core audience, and that core audience watches horror endlessly. And like they will go and get out stream DVDs, whatever they can get their hands on, to watch old horror movies, but crucially, the latest hits. Now, this means that any horror narrative you construct needs to take account of the biggest box office hits in the genre in the last 2 or 3 years, because your audience has seen those.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's not the cult films you've got to worry about, it's the big box office ones. So, like, Sinners reach millions of people compared with a lot of horror films that are released. So, if you're working in the horror genre and you're dealing with vampires, you've got to say, what am I bringing that Sinners didn't have?
Mm.
Do you see what I mean? You're actually asking yourself from the get-go, where is the audience? I had an horrific conversation once with a young writer director in the UK where they were doing it, they'd written a vampire script.
Mm.
This is a few years ago, and the producer knew there were problems with it. So they called me and they said, Phil, can you help me out here? This guy's, written this script and I don't think it works. He needs a conversation about what doesn't work. So I came in, had a conversation. And in the course of an hour, I realized that the guy didn't get not only some of the key elements of the genre framework and what makes it work, but worse than that, he hadn't taken on board that the generation of people he was trying to address had watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer for the last 5 or 6 years.
Right.
And so they'd explored the whole sort of vampire world, etc., in great depth at home in a very, very successful TV series.
Yeah.
And he was writing a script as though that had never happened.
Right.
And
Right.
it was like, I'm sorry, it's not going to work,
Mm.
because you're not doing anything that wasn't in that TV series that all of your audience has just sat through.
Yeah. The literacy of the audience is there, right? It's
Yeah,
established.
and in the horror genre more than any other genre,
Yeah.
it's really, really important. Now, the
No.
final thing I would say on the basic framework is something that is also there in thrillers, good thrillers, that is, which is the presence of innocence. Now, you've got to ask yourself, why do we need an innocent or the presence of innocence in a horror movie? in the same way that we do in thrillers. And it's very simple, actually, but often overlooked. It's the fact that we need to understand that this thing that's out to destroy, in whatever form it takes, is really dangerous because it will actually take the life of something that has done no wrong.
Mm.
Now that is the benchmark of our ultimate fear. We understand the idea that, a ghost might come and attack someone who's morally corrupt or done something bad in the past.
Yeah.
But if they attack someone who's done nothing to deserve it, then we, the audience, understand this is really dangerous. This is really evil.
Yeah.
Without that, you're not putting that boundary in the narrative.
Yeah, I think I was thinking, Phil, I mean, that's such a great point because you need that juxtaposition of innocence and, the evil in a way to sort of highlight the danger and the peril. It's a really important point, I think. And we all are familiar with that sort of, the idea of terrible things happening to young people or innocent people, and the sort of the feeling that that evokes, I think, is something that's really good to sort of, it's a really good juxtaposition, I guess, to sort of and get people empathizing, and to highlight
Yeah.
that peril.
I mean, my favorite, which is a long way back now, was in the very, very first Alien film, where
Yeah.
the innocent was the cat.
Yeah,
And it was like, whoa,
exactly. It's fantastic. Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
sort of think, yeah, no, that's creative thinking. That
Yeah.
is.
And
No
Ripley
one
saved the
will
cat.
think that the cat deserves to die.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. Funnily enough, we just did a sort of little breakdown of Alien. We covered Alien on the podcast before, so yeah,
Um,
that's a great point.
I
Yeah.
mean, the
So
only other thing I'd wrap up around here is, like I said at the very beginning, what I gave you so far is what I would call the primary elements, what you're looking for in every single horror movie.
yeah, yeah,
But there are three distinct types of horror movie in my overall thinking. There's what I call the monster horror, which it speaks for itself, really.
yeah,
It's where the antagonist is a monster that is of our world in some way, shape, or form. They
mm,
could be a mutant. They can be, a bug that's got completely out of control. But it's something of our world, and it's a monster within it. It's
yes.
it's capable of taking over our space.
Mm. So do you think
Um,
less of the supernatural in the sort of monster
No,
movie
no, because
thing?
the thing there is you've got to actually, I should have defined this more clearly. Supernatural is made up of two words,
Mm,
super and natural.
right.
The whole point about horror is there's a natural element to the antagonistic force, i.e.,
Yeah.
there's a world in which it belongs, and then there's a super element to it, which is the thing that is potentially going to destroy us. And these are two very important, linked in the term supernatural. So yeah, monsters are of our world, but they're super. They have powers beyond what we as
I
human
see.
beings
Right.
have.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, Now the other one I've mentioned several times in this conversation, which is the idea of ghost stories and spirits. I
Yeah.
don't think I need to go into that anymore.
Yeah.
The one that would surprise people, I think, is I put disaster movies in the horror camp.
Yeah.
Uh, because here what you're talking about is that a fire or a volcano or a massive wave or something like that can ultimately have a life of its own and potentially destroy. Now, we watch this in real life over the last few years where these massive fires have taken over parts of Australia, parts of America, parts of Southern Europe, and got completely out of control.
Mm,
And human beings were dealing with what is a supernatural force. A fire in itself is not dangerous. It's dangerous when it gets out of control and starts taking on a life of its own beyond what you can predict and
yeah.
what you can manage. And so I put disaster movies actually in the horror camp because if you analyze them, they have all those primary elements I talked about in the first part of this conversation. but it's just that its nature itself has become supernatural.
Yeah. And that's really interesting, I think, because you can see, when you start to look at disaster movies, those sort of essential elements of the horror genre kind of being in there.
Yeah.
But then this idea of the antagonist, the power of nature itself is the sort of the antagonist,
Yeah,
as you sort of phrase it, and it sort of presents this kind of unstoppable force. I think is really, you can definitely see the links in how you're framing, the disaster movie with the horror genre more broadly. I thought that was really fascinating.
yeah, yeah. So basically, those are the three subgenre that you're going to end up working in one of those if you're doing a horror piece.
Yes,
And
right.
like I said, the real trick in development is to spot early on whether you're really doing a horror piece or whether you're doing a thriller or even a personal drama, like with Frankenstein. And and it's like, Twilight was essentially a romance piece. It
Mm.
was not a horror piece, even though it had vampires and werewolves rampant throughout the whole thing.
Yeah.
Um,
And just
and
to
this is,
clarify, Phil, that's
yeah,
because those sort of supernatural elements in air quotes
yeah,
were of this world. It
they
wasn't
were of our
something that,
world.
yeah, it
Yeah,
was. So yeah, you can definitely see how that kind of works.
yeah. I mean, the really extreme one was Underworld, where you were
Yeah.
in the world of the werewolves, but not for 1 second did that classify as a horror movie.
Mm,
It was
yeah.
it was a personal drama. It was a fight between different family groups, which is a
Yes.
classic personal drama setup.
Right. Right. Yeah. That's fascinating, isn't it? Yeah, it's great. Yeah, so we've sort of covered the main sort of the primary elements of the horror genre, and you've gone through those, and some secondary elements as well, and these ideas of sort of monster movies or monster horror, ghost stories, disaster movies. Is there anything you sort of wanted to say just with regards to those sort of three definition or those three categories sort of individually? And I think the only sort of other thing that I was interested in talking to you about a little bit was this idea of style in sort of horror
Mm.
films, and the type of sort of style or how you would define style within the horror genre, as opposed to say the thriller genre, and some of the sort of differences there.
I mean, in terms of visual style, the
Yes. Yeah.
thriller and the horror are basically in the same camp. They're modern interpretations of German expressionism,
Yeah.
which came about in the 1930s, well, 20s and 30s.
Yeah. So you've got
And and we
Murnau
had the
and
first Nosferatu film back then, and you can
yeah.
sort of see expressionism written in a very stark, simplistic version back then. And we've essentially adapted that into our contemporary
Mm,
language. Beyond that, naturalism tends to be worked in something like let them in,
yeah.
where you're not trying to really push the boundaries of style that much. It's still expressionist pretty much, but
Yes.
it's very close to a sort of naturalist look.
Yeah. Yeah.
All the scenes are shot at a standard naturalist eye level,
Hmm.
apart from odd moments. Um, but these are exceptional works.
Mm.
The vast, vast bulk are dealing with expressionism.
Yeah, so something like Let the Right One In is a more sort of naturalistic approach, and you can see that
Yeah,
visually. Whereas other horror films are sort of much more expressionistic in their sort of depiction of the world,
yeah.
how the camera's moving, different sorts of angles
Uses
and
of light and
sound
shadow. I
and
mean, the fact
yeah.
that most horror movies at some point end up being at night is not an accident.
No,
That,
that's right.
that's the ultimate space for expressionist lighting and shadows and
Yeah.
everything else.
Yeah. And you can also hide the slightly ropey looking monsters if you haven't got a great
Yeah,
budget.
yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, Lee, was there anything that you sort of just wanted to ask, sort of generally about sort of the horror genre and screen. Lee is an absolute horror nut, by the way, Phil. He is Mr. Horror on the podcast.
I had a couple of questions quite generic. You probably get asked them all the time, but do you have a favorite horror movie? And do you have
No,
a favorite horror
I
screenplay?
don't have favorite movies, full stop.
Yeah.
There's very good reasons for that. One is I know that things come and go in my
Mm,
life, film
Mm,
wise, and that it may be the film I like this year, but 5 years from now,
yeah.
no, it's not that great anymore. And the secondary thing, I find that when I'm in development or lecturing or whatever, if I say, oh, this is a great film,
Mm,
everyone starts to think, oh, well, that's where he's coming from.
got
And I
you.
don't want people to do that because that's
Yeah.
not what I'm about. It's not that, when I'm analyzing stuff or discussing works with people, I'm trying to get them to make a certain type of film. What I'm trying to discover is the unique work that they want to make.
Yeah.
mm.
And that means I can't impose a whole pile of, oh, well, you must watch this movie because it's absolutely the best of what you're trying to do. No,
Yeah.
don't do
Yeah.
that. It's a block.
I understand completely. Yeah, yeah, that's cool. I did have another question. Oh yeah, so we were talking about you were talking earlier about how horror kind of changes over the decades to kind of reflect what's been happening in that decade. Like you mentioned AI, for example, and in the early days of cinema, it was all ghosts and like folk tales and things like that. So I'm wondering if you have any sort of predictions on where you think horror will go next.
I think that the most interesting thing about horror, and it's often overlooked, and I do have to emphasize this when I talk about it in lectures, which I don't do very often, it has to be said these days, um, is that the real beauty of horror is that it can take an audience and force them to address a contemporary issue that they're ducking.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you remember back in the 80s and 90s, there was a string of horror movies that dealt with child abuse at a
Mm.
point where absolutely nobody was talking about child abuse in the mainstream
Yeah.
cinema or culture. And if you go to Sinners last year, that was overtly talking about racism
Hmm.
in America.
Yeah.
And, and that's a very live issue today. And it's why it won the Oscars, because to Americans, it's addressing something that they're very conscious in their contemporary culture.
Yeah.
I don't think Sinners, is going to work anything like as well in Africa, the Middle East, or Indian subcontinent.
Yeah.
Mm.
Um, But in America, absolutely nailed a contemporary issue. It
Yeah.
was very live. So horror can do these two things. It can either bring into the mainstream something that most people are not even aware of sometimes, but equally it can address, you know, cultural issues that people are aware of but are sort of ducking.
Yeah.
Like they're trying to sort of go, well, it's there, but
Mm.
no, we're not really going to go there too often. And
Yeah.
horror is brilliant at that. It's absolutely brilliant. I mean, I would probably say of all the four main genres, it's probably the most political in that sense,
Yeah.
in the sense of the small p. Um, it has this ability to make an audience embrace something, recognize something in a way that in other genres you'll struggle quite often to get an audience to go there. So that's
Okay.
one of the passions about horror.
Yeah.
It's one of the great reasons that horror's always been special.
Yeah.
It's like it's like in the early versions of Nosferatu and Dracula, it was all about sexual repression.
Mm.
Again, something people didn't talk about. People didn't want to admit that women had sexual desires,
Yeah.
and horror's been brilliant at this throughout its
Yeah.
history as a cinema genre.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, when you start looking at some of these films and thinking about how they're using metaphor, through their characters and through their monsters or their antagonists. and or analogy and what that can sort of relate to and mean and what people are trying to say. I think that's fascinating to unpack.
Yeah,
Yeah.
indeed.
Okay, Phil. Well,
Anyway, but I think that's all we can say in this short session.
absolutely. Yeah, you've been so generous with your time. And again, we can't thank you enough for coming on and chatting because I know, it was as I sort of mentioned right at the top, your book was so clarifying for us whilst we were doing our
Absolutely.
MA, really helped us think about, as I said, genre, theme, style, tone, and really sort of helped us distill our kind of the way in which we're talking about projects,
Yeah.
obviously in development, but also, when we're actually talking to people about them, pitching or, sort of looking for feedback, that sort of thing. So can't thank you enough for coming on. Your insights are really inspiring, truly, truly appreciated. I recommend highly that anyone listening to this go out and get Phil's book, The Art and Science of Screenwriting, because I can't say enough about how influential it was for me, and I know Lee feels the same.
Absolutely,
Um,
absolutely. It's literally kind of defined the way I write and think about screenplays. And yeah, I mean, thank you so much, Phil. I mean, that book has just been absolutely brilliant. And like Will said, thank you for your time. I mean, I could literally sit and listen to you talk all day. It's absolutely fascinating.
Dangerous,
Absolutely
dangerous.
fascinating.
um, but yeah, I mean, I'd recommend everyone go. Phil, where can people sort of find you, reach you? Do you have a website, or do
I don't have a website,
no?
interestingly enough. You can reach me on my standard email, or you can find me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, LinkedIn is
Yeah,
probably the best place.
LinkedIn's
Yeah,
the
Yeah,
best place.
LinkedIn's
Yeah.
probably the
yeah.
best bet.
Fantastic. But it's been a real pleasure. It's been a real honor. And that was a little sort of a look into how sort of Phil thinks about the horror genre. And your unpacking of that, Phil, was really, really insightful. So thanks so much for coming on.
Pleasure.
And we really, really appreciate it.
That's cool. Well, the best of luck with the podcast and the writing. The writing is the key,
Well,
don't forget.
that's
Doing
right.
podcasts is nice.
Yeah,
Writing good screenplays is the goal.
That's where we want to be.
absolutely.
Absolutely.
100%.
Okay,
All right.
fantastic.
Take
Brilliant stuff.
care.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much, Phil.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, well, there we go, Lee. That's an interview there with Phil Parker. I mean, first of all, just I think worth saying, Phil is just we're so grateful that Phil was able to make some time and come on the show and
Mm.
obviously, talk about the genre, the horror genre. And again, just to sort of reiterate for all you listeners out there, Phil's book, The Art and Science of Screenwriting, is such a great kind of resource for screenwriters. Again, just to sort of demystify some of these definitions and some of these sort of words that we use when we're sort of developing projects, and really kind of clarifies ideas around genre and obviously sort of specifically theme, which we reference kind of Phil's work quite a lot with the themes, don't we, in the episodes.
Yeah, yeah.
And obviously sort of style and tone, but there's lots in there as well about sort of assessing your ideas and which
Mhm.
ideas to take forward, obviously character development, that sort of thing. So it's a really amazing kind of resource for screenwriters. Definitely recommend that you seek that out. There'll be some links in the description there. But we thought we could do a little sort of breakdown as we do normally after these interviews, and just sort of take the key takeaways and just sort of try and highlight some of those things. And we focused obviously very much on horror in this episode, but Phil has sort of broken down what he sort of refers to as four primary genres, that being sort of thrillers, horrors, personal dramas, and romances. And it's worth kind of seeking out his work and just sort of taking a deep dive into those other genre as well, and reading those breakdowns because they'll be helpful sort of moving forward in your work if you're not working necessarily specifically in a horror space. But yeah, were there any sort of broad kind of big takeaways from that, Lee, that conversation with Phil, that you sort of picked up on specifically related to horror, or anything that you found really sort of interesting or insightful?
I mean, it was all. I think it was all very interesting. Just to jump on the bandwagon and praise Phil's book again. But yeah, it's I own a lot of screenwriting books. Like I think I must have nearly 100 now,
Yeah.
and the art and science of screenwriting is one of a small handful that I constantly refer back to sort of
Yeah,
regular
same.
on a regular basis. You know, it's one of my go-to books. And we're not just saying that because Phil's a friend of the podcast, but yeah, it is a fantastic book, and it
Yeah.
is easily the most referenced. Like in my copy is dog-eared. I've got like bookmarks like sticking out of it. But I'm constantly referring back to that book. It's one of my top three easily. Top
Oh,
one. It's a
definitely.
top one. It's my top one easy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, he's given us some really good sort of talking points and a really good kind of checklist of elements that we can, especially myself, I can sort of attribute to future projects. I mean, there's a new project I'm going to start soon, and I'm definitely going to sort of work through the treatment again and just
Mm.
check off, make sure all of these the primary elements of the horror genre are in there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, you know, take it where it's going to go on the secondary. And but one thing that really sort of stood out for me was where he was saying about bear in mind the more recent horror films of that genre that have been released, like not the classics, because I always think of the classics. I think of it might just be my old brain, but I always sort of like
Halloween.
default back to The Thing and Halloween and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Nightmare on Elm Street and everything. And but like you said, people won't have people will have seen them, but they won't be fresh in the collective psyche of the audiences.
Yeah.
Whereas something like Sinners, Weapons, probably things like that they will still be kind of floating around in the cultural zeitgeist. So
Yeah.
you've got to kind of bear in mind that people will be kind of referencing and comparing your work to like the more recent horror films that they've seen. So you've got to just bearing that kind of thing in mind was a real kind of, it sounds really obvious when you think about it, but I'd never kind of thought about it before.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
that's yeah, that was a definite moment for
Mm.
me. How about
But it's
yourself?
interesting because that kind of links to some advice that we get or we have gotten sort of relatively recently, which is to, sort of you're not thinking about what necessarily is in the cultural sort of zeitgeist now. When you're
Mm,
writing your films, you're possibly trying to project out maybe sort of 2, 3 years and think about what's coming down the tube sort of thing.
yeah.
And writing your screenplays maybe about sort of those things that you think
Mm,
may be coming to us rather than and you see that through when we were sort of talking about horror through the decades, you sort of
yeah.
see each decade has its kind of broadly has its kind of theme that it or something that it's investigating, whether that's
Mm,
AI or whether that's whatever it may be. So
yeah.
I think that sort of links quite nicely to that tip as well, to not just be focusing on the now, but thinking about what's
Mm,
coming and how can you create something interesting regarding
yeah.
what's coming rather than where you
Yeah.
are right now.
I
Yeah.
think what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of a fascist, kind of dictatory kind of I think we're going to get some kind of big couple of big movies around that kind of thing
Yeah,
in
or
the next
populism or something like
couple of
that,
years.
right?
Yeah, yeah. I think we'll get something that will, evil governments and stuff like that. I
Yeah.
think that'll be the next kind of big thing that will pop up in a couple of years' time.
Yeah.
Obviously,
Starship Troopers would be good, wouldn't it? In that sort of
yeah,
very much
Starship
kind of
Troopers
look
would
at
be a good
the
one.
fascist kind of
Um,
authoritarian state.
yeah, yeah, I think that could be that will probably be where the sort of next sort of cultural horror shift will be until it
Yeah.
sort of moves on to something else. But
Yeah. Well, I thought
yeah,
what we could do, Lee, is obviously Phil talks so kind of eloquently about this and has really sort of broken it down really well. But I thought we could just round up maybe some of the things that Phil sort of mentioned regarding the horror genre specifically,
yeah,
just
yep.
as sort of a quick roundup for
Hmm.
our listeners and things that they can maybe take away. And if you want to jump in and just sort of talk about any of these as we go, obviously feel free.
Yeah.
But the first thing, I mean, Phil sort of spoke about was the sort of primary elements of the horror genre, and gave us sort of several points here for things that he sort of considers primary elements of the genre. And the first one there is that there's an ordinary world in which the protagonists live prior to the sort of arrival of danger or the, i.e. the sort of the supernatural. And that's generally a sort of environment that we're all familiar with, before the kind of outbreak of all of the supernatural chaos that comes, right?
Yeah.
Such an important kind of element there, I think, to establish for the audience where you are and give them something to sort of relate to, but also establishes, your empathy for the protagonist with the audience, right?
Mm. Yeah. And I think that's also worth pointing out that the ordinary world is like ordinary to the protagonist. It's not necessarily an ordinary world to us. So it
Mm.
doesn't have to be like, running down to Tesco's on a Friday morning or working as a barista in Starbucks. The ordinary world for them could be a mining colony on Mars or
Yeah,
a
or a space station
spaceship or
or
a
whatever. Yeah,
medieval village. But it's just to show that ordinary to the character. It's their world, their ordinary world. And obviously, like if we use a world that we're all familiar with, it just makes the job easier, but it doesn't necessarily have to be ordinary as in contemporary, modern,
sort of mundane,
relatable. Yeah,
feeding the
yeah,
dog or whatever. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
No, that's a great point. And then sort of the second thing that Phil was sort of mentioning was, this idea of a presence of a supernatural force.
Mm,
And that, again, just to sort of clarify, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a ghost or something like that, but it's a power sort of beyond the protagonist's ability initially to deal with or
yeah.
understand in the first instance, right?
Yeah, I thought he broke that down really well, to be honest. Like, just obvious as it sounds, like, you know, natural being like an everyday something, but then it's super, as in like it's
Yeah,
enhanced or, greater than it should be. And I thought that was quite a cool like breakdown of it. So then you got like the shark in Jaws under that kind of description could be, effectively supernatural because it's like
a
a,
giant
a
shark.
giant, yeah, a giant shark. So
Yeah.
I thought that was quite a cool way of explaining it as well.
Yeah, and it's certainly out of the ordinary in that, Amityville or whatever it's called doesn't really get too many shark visits, right? So
I
it's
think I
something.
think it's just Amity, mate.
Oh, is it
Amityville, if
Amity?
Amityville with a shark in it would be like probably the greatest movie I've ever seen in my life if they ever made it. But
Yeah, well, yeah. So the other thing that Phil mentions, and I think it's really important to the genre, is obviously the central protagonist or protagonists face death.
hmm.
And this is something we see, pretty much in all horror, right? But what would a horror film be without any um, sort of threat of death to the protagonist? It would be nowhere, wouldn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this was one of the sort of few things that I was kind of on the verge of disagreeing with. Um, obviously, but the way it's written, the central protagonists face death. Um, a lot of like scarier films I've seen have been like the protagonist trying to protect someone incapable of defending themselves. So the protagonists themselves don't directly face death, but they face it in the way that they're trying to. A lot of horror movies, for example, it'll be the something will be coming after the kids. It won't
Yeah,
be coming
yeah,
after the adults, it'll be coming after the kids. So the adults are never really in threat of danger, but obviously their children are, and that's the kind of sort of threat kind of thing. So that one I was on the verge of kind of sort of questioning, but the way it's set out in our show notes, the central protagonists face death. That's still them facing death, just not as a threat to themselves necessarily. Does that
yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, no, I think it's it's like you say, you don't necessarily have to have the protagonist facing death specifically,
Mm,
but there needs to be, some sort of death danger,
yes.
whether that's to, and we sort of mentioned in the episode, that can be to maybe a B or a C character that gets killed off, or someone like you say that they're trying to protect, And this is kind of mentioned in, Snyder's kind of beat sheet and the sort of all is lost sort of phase of that, that
Mm.
there is a sort of sense of death, or there's a whiff of death, or there's, somebody dies
Yeah.
in, sort of Snyder's breakdown as well. But certainly death needs to be a presence within the film. And the
Yeah.
threat of death either to the protagonist or to someone that they know or are protecting or are connected to in some way.
Mm.
That sort of needs to sort of happen there. But I think that's a good distinction that you sort of mentioned there.
Yeah. I mean, the other good thing I think that Phil pointed out was it's not usually actually dying that people are afraid of. It's all of the things that they haven't had a chance to do.
Or the
You know, it's
incomplete
it's
life,
the
right? That was
lost
really interesting.
potential. Yeah, it's like the lost potential of their lives that they're sort of fearing. So it's like I don't know, old Jimmy isn't afraid of death so much, but he's afraid of dying before he can, like, tell his daughter how much he loves her,
Yeah,
or
exactly.
something like that. There's always that kind of, there's always a reason. They have a reason to stay alive, to do something, like some kind of life goal that they need to achieve. If it's like, I don't know, depressed Billy No Mates, he's probably just going to be like, yeah, whatever, just make it quick. But
Yeah. No, but
and
that was
that's not going to be
really
very compelling, is it, to watch? So
a really interesting thing because I was, like I said, when we were talking to Phil, it always to me sort of seemed like the fear was of the pain that precedes death, the
yes,
sort
yeah,
but sort of Phil is really sort of stating that I think it's that idea of incomplete life, or that idea that there's
mm,
something that needs to be done before death, whether that's right or wrong, or tell a
yeah.
child that they love them, or a regret that they want to sort of try and correct. Yeah, so that was really interesting, I thought. A great sort of sort of clarifying definition, I think, there,
Definitely.
for writers. The other one was the force of antagonism is not only sort of supernatural, but must initially be clever and stronger than the protagonists. And that's similar to thrillers, but that's something you see quite often in horror movies, isn't it? That the protagonist is initially baffled by the sort of overwhelming strength of whatever it is they're facing.
Yeah.
And the next one is really dealing with sort of themes, and we've mentioned this so many times, so we're like a broken record. But the two major themes which sort of underpin the genre are basically this idea of fear of death, which we just talked about, but also obviously fear of the unknown. So that's I think something that we talk about quite a bit. Did you have anything else to sort of say on those, or
I think we kind of just covered the fear of death thing a second ago.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, I mean, obviously, and fear of the unknown, not knowing what's coming after you, not knowing how to deal with it.
yeah,
Obviously, it's our fear of the unknown.
yeah. And the next point was in horror narratives. There can be this omnipresent point of view, so the audience can be sort of placed in any position in relation to the characters. And that's something to sort of consider when you're writing horror, isn't it? Is that you don't necessarily always have to be uh, in the sort of protagonist's point of view. And in fact, much of the horror or much of the fear that you sort of get from horror films is from this omnipresent kind of POV, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's really good to work that into your scripts in a way. And I was actually thinking about this after talking to Phil, but it's you can obviously easily sort of understand how you do that within the sort of the photography of a film. Um,
Yeah.
but it's you sort of have to be maybe a little bit more subtle in terms of how you do that in your writing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
that's something I think is I'm going to certainly think about moving forward is, how do you sort of get this omnipresent POV into your script and hint at that in the script
Yeah.
rather than, it just being something that a director or DOP sort of works through, on set.
Mm.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that specifically, but it's something I was going to take.
Um, no, not really. I mean, I think you've pretty much nailed that one down, to be honest. It's like you say, it's a tricky thing, kind of getting your vision on the page without overwriting it or going into camera directions.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's like you always say, screenwriting is a collaborative medium, so you have to have faith that, the director, the DOP, the cinematographer, they're going to bring your words to life in a satisfying manner. But I mean, there are obviously a lot of tricks you can do.
Yeah.
You know, most I'm sure most screenwriters listening will kind of know them. You know, you can write an extreme close up without having to write the words extreme close up. You know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um,
Suggest rather than
yeah,
yeah.
you can write the action line in a way where it can't really be anything else. You know, like a tear pools in the corner of their eye, for example. That's got to be like a macro shot. You know, there's
Yeah,
no other way to do that. So,
yeah,
you know, if they
yeah,
keep that shot, they're going to have to do it the way you envision it.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that's great. So something to think about there, I think. And then we went on to talk about the nature of the plot, and how that sort of affects the main plot lines. And in this context, there were sort of three storylines that dominate the genre. Um,
yeah,
and that was the unrecognized virtue, the fatal flaw, and the spider and the fly. Um,
yeah,
and I think this is really interesting. I mean, it's really sort of a quite masterful kind of breakdown of, the main plot lines that you see in horror, because you see these all the time, you know.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
in pretty much every horror film,
Mm,
one or two of these are absolutely present. And
yeah,
certainly the fatal flaw in the antagonist, the
yeah,
spider and the fly you see in so many horror films.
yeah,
And as well as this sort of idea of unrecognized virtue, a skill that is
mm,
gone unrecognized.
yeah.
Um, I mean, horror is replete with these three sort of storylines, right?
Yeah, yeah, and the best ones I think are when the unrecognized virtue is kind of the antithesis of the fatal flaw. You
Yeah,
know, they're
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
like mirror sides of one another.
yeah.
So, and I think that just kind of plays fantastically well when you can juggle it, when you can manage it. It's absolutely brilliant.
The other thing I was thinking was it's interesting that it might not be the fatal flaw, but a lot of the sort of characters that get bumped off, or the characters, let's say, around the protagonist, they often have a flaw which leads to their downfall.
Yeah,
And the protagonist is sort of not necessarily pure, but is sort of has less flaws, I guess, or more
yeah,
redeeming qualities that means that they, the final girl is the classic one, right? That they
absolutely.
sort
Yeah.
of see them through. But that was really interesting. I think that's definitely worth really thinking about and considering and sort of seeing, have you got this in your film? Because it is very important. That's not
Hmm.
has to be obviously prescribed, but it's, you can bring your own creativity to these ideas and
Yeah.
make them your own, obviously. So the next one was the protagonist's actions must be credibly realistic or natural in their representation on screen. The antagonists are obviously sort of more supernatural, even if in the beginning they don't appear to be so.
Yeah.
And this is again something you see all across horror, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Now this one I thought was is really cool, but the existence of an expert is critical to the plot.
Mm.
And again, I mean, this is a great sort of expositional tool, but it's
Yeah.
also, a great means of finding the sort of the key to overcoming the antagonist, if you like, is
Yeah.
kind of idea of an expert character.
Mm.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be an expert on the antagonist per se, but they have some expertise which go towards defeating that antagonistic force. Um,
Yeah, yeah, this was an interesting one for me because I can certainly think of a lot of times where an expert has been like, introduced to the plot. But I really sort of sat down and kind of played with this one for a while. I was just plucking out random horror movies and thinking, is there an expert in this one? And just trying to kind of sort of see if I could nail it down. For example, Alien, for example, who would you say was the expert in Alien?
Well, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because they all have, well, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here now that you mentioned this, but I think all of the characters have expertise in various areas, don't they? Uh, and I think probably you're looking at Ash as
Yeah,
being the,
that's
you
what
know,
I came to on that one.
yeah, I mean,
It's like it was
he is
Ash. Yeah,
revealing the alien's life
yeah,
cycle and
mm,
ideas about, how indestructible this alien is.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd say Ash in
What
Aliens.
about Nightmare on Elm Street?
Well, it's been a long time since I've seen that, Lee. It's probably about 13 when I watched that last.
Yeah.
Can you think of anyone in Nightmare on Elm Street that
The only one I could think of was,
isn't there a character that reveals part of Freddy's past?
yeah, that's Nancy's mother,
Hmm.
who kind of gives us Freddy's backstory. But Nancy herself kind of becomes the expert almost on that one. I mean, her dad obviously is a cop, so he has expertise in other areas. But
Yeah.
when I was thinking of that, because that was a couple of the ones that I sort of like, there were three that I sort of like just plucked out randomly.
Hmm.
That was the one I had most trouble with. I think I'd probably go with Nancy's mum as
Yeah.
the expert now. And the other one I just sort of like randomly plucked out was Jeepers Creepers,
Okay.
and there absolutely is an expert character in that one.
Right.
Like she literally is. Have you seen Jeepers Creepers?
No.
Okay, so it's basically a psychic. There's a psychic lady who kind of sees all the stuff that's happening, and she literally just like phones our sort of like heroes up, and just drops a fucking bomb of exposition on them and telling them like everything. It literally is just like a random psychic woman, like halfway across the country, just kind of like rings them up and says, like, "Yeah, he's gonna do this, and this," and just so
A
there
handy
is an
plot
expert in there as
contrivance.
well. Sorry?
A handy plot contrivance.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So yeah, I was always thinking like Van Helsing is probably the archetypal kind of
Oh yeah, he is, isn't he? Yeah,
expert, character that
100%.
pops up. Anyway, the next one here, and I think sort of the last one in terms of these primary elements is this presence of innocence. Um, and that really explains itself, doesn't it? I mean, the sort of loss of innocence is such a powerful sort
Mm,
of sub-theme that goes into horror. And yeah, so I think that's kind of really important. And certainly,
yeah,
the protagonist is often the kind of the personification of this innocence, right?
often, yeah, yeah,
Um, and that certainly helps with this idea of empathy and it heightens the peril,
yeah,
if someone is sort of thoroughly innocent. Um, okay, so and then we sort of talked a little bit about these sort of secondary elements, and and this I thought was really interesting, as Phil talking about these sort of three distinctive subgenres, uh,
mm,
and that of the ghost story, the monster horror, and then the disaster movie, which I thought was a real
yeah,
revelation. Uh,
yeah, absolutely. I would not have put that there in a million years.
but it really, really works. So, I mean,
It
I'll run
does, yeah.
through ghost stories initially, Phil's sort of saying, this is probably the most intimate of the horror sort of genre, and it is the subgenre which relies heaviest on a well-developed characters as much as intricate plotting. And sort of the main story is concerned with a ghost, obviously entering the life of a family, or in some cases, an individual's life.
Hmm.
And that the main characters are ordinary people, i.e., in the general course of their lives, they don't encounter the threat or the danger. And but obviously, sort of, they don't encounter the threat of death and danger as
Yeah,
encountered in this genre. The themes of these narratives is often fear of death, and a past wrong or possible repeat of a past wrong is crucial to the plot. You see that so many times, don't you, in
yeah,
kind of ghost
yeah,
stories, right? That a wrong has been committed, and
yeah.
the
Spirit can't
investigation to
rest
defeat the
until
ghost. Or yeah,
yeah,
exactly, right.
yeah,
You have to you have to right that wrong in some way. Or find out what the wrong was to understand the ghost, or the spirit. I thought that was great, that one. And then, the action centers on discovering the truth about the ghost story, which obviously
mm,
links to the previous one very strongly. The protagonist's point of view plays a significant part in this subgenre, and the presence of only a small number of victims, often only one or two in the whole film.
yeah,
So that's a sort of a more contained a kind of death count in a
yeah.
ghost story. Um, so yeah, I thought that was really interesting. uh,
Yeah, absolutely.
talking about ghost stories. I quite like a ghost story, actually, Lee. I'm sort of a bit of a fan of ghost stories in the
Yeah,
horror.
I'll be honest, I'm more of a monster movie kind of guy myself, but
To
a
their
good
own.
ghost story it is often scarier than a
Yeah.
good monster story. I think ghost stories usually are the scariest, most sort of frightening because, like you say, they're very intimate, aren't they? They're
Mm.
very small scale.
And there's definitely something otherworldly about them because I struggle to believe in monster stories, but if I'm sort of presented with a good ghost story, you're like, ooh, something unnerving about that. You never quite know.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, anyway, that sort of leads us on to these ideas of monster movies. So monsters sort of, unlike ghosts, generally remain within the reality of our world, often have some supernatural, but have sort of supernatural powers, often only strength and speed, but critically, they're difficult to kill.
Yeah,
And the antagonist in monster movies, the antagonist or antagonists derive their power from their supernatural powers. So the antagonist, the power is of a supernatural sort of variety.
yeah.
Um, and the protagonist, it says actually this is an ensemble genre generally, but face
Mhm.
death at the hands of the monsters. That's
Yep.
sort of, if you look at something like Monster Squad, right, this has that all over
Yeah.
it.
Pretty
Um,
much every slasher movie as well.
yeah, yeah,
Fits
yeah,
perfectly
absolutely.
into this mold.
Yeah, absolutely. Protagonists fail to successfully confront the antagonist until the climax, and the plot hinges on who will survive and to some extent why.
Yep.
Great insight, this. Um, the theme of this subgenre is fear of the unknown, and the plot needs various characters to act as victims in the early part of the narrative.
Yep.
Um, so yeah, yeah. I mean, that's great. Great insight there.
Yeah.
Um, Phil actually referenced The Descent as one of the that sort of sticks to this monster movie idea pretty
hmm
clearly. And if you
Yeah.
look at
Yeah. There's some good
everything,
ones in there like Jaws, Alien,
yeah,
The
yeah,
Descent,
absolutely.
Jurassic Park, Halloween.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Fantastic
And you can
stuff.
see it, can't you, when you start to break down these films.
Yeah.
Um, and then we went on to the disaster film, didn't we? And this was really
Yeah.
interesting, I thought. But in essence, Phil is sort of saying that this is a variation of the monster film, but this
Yeah.
time we're confronting the supernatural power, and that is the supernatural power is actually nature itself.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah. I did too.
Yeah. And the key differences here are Phil sort of said that, like the murder mystery being a variation on the investigative thriller. So this genre shares the majority of the monster film's key elements, but the key differences are the power of the antagonist is the power of nature itself.
hmm
The plot pits the protagonist against an unstoppable force, i.e., an earthquake or a tsunami or whatever it is. And the protagonists represent a wider society or community than in other horror narratives. So if you think
Yeah.
about it, a ghost movie is, very sort of intimate.
Yeah.
Monster movies have their sort of core group of, protagonists battling
Yeah.
the monster. Whereas, in a disaster movie, you really need that wider view of society and the world,
Mm.
how this thing will affect that. And the protagonists kind of represent that in some way,
Yeah.
rather than having to have a million characters that you're following, and sort of connecting to all of them. So yeah, I mean, I sort of found that inclusion of disaster movies a real revelation, actually, in this.
Yeah.
Really fascinating stuff.
It did pop a really interesting question into my head. I'm going to throw it at you with no preparation or warning, so be wary. Is Godzilla the original a monster movie or a disaster movie?
Ah, that's a great question. Um, I'd have to familiarize myself a little bit more with that original Godzilla film because I
Mm.
don't know uh, what is happening around the monster. I can't
Yeah.
remember. Like, is there a core team of sort of scientists trying to unlock what's going on that the protagonist emerges from?
hmm
Is there, uh, yeah, you can kind of see both in there,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, I'd have to familiarize myself a bit more with the film, but what was your initial take on that?
I think I went with disaster movie on that one, on
Interesting.
the original Godzilla, and you could argue it with -1, I think, as well. A lot of the Godzilla movies, I think it's a fine balance. Like Shin as well, I think is definitely a disaster movie. I think Shin, the original Shin, -1, Returns. I think every time they reboot Godzilla, or
Mm.
like they do a fresh take on Godzilla, I think they always tend to start out as a disaster movie, and then it kind of expands. They bring in more monsters, and then it kind of becomes a monster movie, I think.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm going to have to go back, Lee, and do a Godzilla marathon. That's
Oh, mate, I did that last year. Like
Did
every
you?
Godzilla film from start to finish.
That would be so
Oh my
good.
God, it was so much fun.
Yeah.
So much fun.
Well, maybe we can give it another couple of years or however long you need, and we can go back and do it together and do a
Dude,
big.
I would love that. I'll do that tomorrow. Like seriously, like I will do that tomorrow. Like
We'll have
you
to.
don't need to convince me to watch Godzilla movies.
I'll have to arrange a weekend, and we can just sit on a couch and eat sugary food and watch Godzilla movies.
I
Wall
feel
to
we need more
wall.
than a weekend. There's like 39 of them, or like
Okay, we need a bit
there's
longer.
a probably I don't know, maybe not quite that many, but there are a lot.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, the thing is you raise an interesting point because it's, one of the great things about all of this is, when you start to sort of learn these things or you pick up these things, uh, the important thing is that you go on and then actually analyze films that you love,
Hmm.
and analyze kind of screenplays that you love, and really try and put these sort of theories into practice, in your own head in terms of dissecting, and that's kind of what we do on the show, isn't it? Sort of
Yeah,
dissecting
yeah,
movies, but really sort of try and put these theories into practice, and sort of, by doing that, you become more familiar with them, you sort of bed them in, and then you can really start to sort of use them in your own work,
yeah,
and play off them in your own work, so you
yeah,
can sort of, if you know the sort of key elements of a particular genre, you can then try to subvert them in interesting and exciting ways through either your characterization or your plotting or whatever it is, right? Your setting and that sort of thing, or your style. So, or tonally. So yeah, so that was that's basically a sort of a quick rundown of the sort of points that Phil covered. And I mean, again, just to say, we sort of really do recommend that people seek out Phil's work.
yeah,
Certainly the art and science of screenwriting, but really sort of read through that and digest it, and sort of take that sort of his work on board, because it's been so helpful for us just in terms of our writing and how we think about things like genre, theme, specifically, and style and tone and that sort of thing. But also, we mentioned this in the episode, how we go about talking about these ideas to other people, in a
yeah,
pitching scenario, or in a sort of scenario where, maybe we're just pitching to friends or whatever for an idea, in the early stages. So yeah, I mean, can't speak highly enough of Phil's work and how it's helped me, and I know you feel the same about it, right?
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Um, so yeah, that was Phil Parker. Really good. Phil was so generous, such a lovely guy as well. Really enthusiastic and generous with his time. And so we again recommend you go and seek out Phil's work. His book is The Art and Science of Screenwriting. We'll include a link in the description as to where you can sort of find that.
Yep,
And possibly some other links to where you can sort of access a little bit more of Phil's work. We'll be back again soon, won't we, Lee? What are we doing next
absolutely.
time?
Next time we have, I'm quite excited. We have a collaboration with Janine from Grey Horror.
Yeah,
Janine is absolutely fantastic. I mean, she knows her knowledge of horror puts mine to shame. Like she is like
and
a
that's saying
walking
something.
encyclopedia. She is a walking encyclopedia of horror movies. And we're going to be chatting about our top 5 hidden gem horror movies. So horror movies that you may not have heard of, but if you haven't, you should definitely check them out. And then after that, we'll resume our regular programming with our script to screen breakdowns, which will start up again for season 4 of the Script to Screen podcast. So stay
Fantastic.
tuned, keep them peeled.
Great stuff. Yeah, really looking forward to chatting to Janine. We met Janine at the Screams by the Sea film festival in Bournemouth, didn't we?
Yes, yeah, we do.
And really sort of connected. And she's such a font of knowledge and so enthusiastic about the genre.
Yeah.
We thought we definitely have to have her on. And I'm really interested to see, what hidden gems she comes up with, but what your list is like as well. And hopefully I won't have you two rolling your eyes too much at my list of hidden horror gems.
Absolutely not, man. Absolutely not. I'm sure there'll be some Oscar-worthy noms on there.
Oh, some beauties in there, Lee. Some absolute beauty. Okay, so that's it, folks. We'll be back soon, and we'll be back with Janine, and then back into our regular our regular programming. But thanks so much for listening. And I think the last thing to say, Lee, is do take care.
Keep on writing those scares.